Greetings everyone, one and all, welcome once more. As always, I am your most humble host, Jay. I return once more from the void between pages to again tell of the bizarre and the unknown. So sit and relax as I again share with you what I've been reading. So as I've mentioned before, I'm a rather big fan of the Legion of Superheroes. I really like their team dynamic, and the depiction of the 30th century in most versions of their continuity is fun. Each Legionnaire feels really distinct, and everyone plays off each other really well. When characters have conflicts, the conflicts feel genuine with their personalities, and likewise when they have them get together as friends or in relationships. It also allows for nice conflict when it comes to the universe at large, and makes them feel more unique when there's large disagreements between the team. As well, every member has a unique and memorable power set. With one notable exception, there's almost zero overlap between members, which prevents anyone from being overshadowed or being made redundant. Which makes it all the worse that not only have they been subject to some of the bigger continuity headaches in comic bookdom, but that DC never really gives any effort into promoting them anymore, and seem to just forget that they even exist most of the time. Naturally, of course, today we're not talking about the Legion of Superheroes. Rather, we're talking about their lesser-known modern-day predecessors, the Legion. Co-written by Keith Giffen and Alan Grant, with Barry Kitson on the pencil work, Legion, which is an acronym standing for Licensed Extra-Governmental Interstellar Operatives Network — hey, it was the 90s, wacky acronyms were popular — tells the story of the eponymous organization, a for-profit peacekeeping group dedicated to taking down criminals galaxy-wide and helping to keep the peace on worlds that need the help and, more importantly, can't afford it. Legion ran for 75 issues, beginning in 1989 and ending in 1994, and was, at least based on my research, immensely popular during its time, although nowadays it's somewhat fallen into obscurity with only Legion fans paying it much attention anymore. Now, as always, a quick recap of the essential backstory information for the comic itself. In the tail end of 1988, DC released an event called Invasion. In Invasion, an intergalactic alliance of alien races, led by the monstrous Dominators, and otherwise comprised of the Khund, the Thanagarians, and a bunch of other races that aren't as important, the Alliance made their way across the galaxy, with a single goal in mind: the complete annihilation of humanity and all superpowered individuals therein. Now, Invasion is a weird event, as while the story and the event itself is rather unremarkable and is pretty much irrelevant to the grand scheme of things, events that occur within Invasion would serve to be rather significant to a wide variety of characters and DC as a whole, including the deaths of nearly all of the Doom Patrol, paving the way to Grant Morrison's now legendary run with the team, as well as introducing the concept of the metagene, a sort of catch-all origin point for characters, with the associated term metahuman becoming the de facto description for superpowered individuals in the DC universe. Within the story itself, a group of prisoners, various individuals taken from across the galaxy as tributes to the Alliance to side with them / spare them from their wrath, managed to engineer a massive escape attempt and free themselves and the rest of the prisoners, taking off to parts unknown, leading into the first issue of the series. With that out of the way, it's time to talk about the series proper. Today we'll be discussing the first year of the story, comprising the first 10 issues. First, let's talk about our characters. Legion is more of an ensemble piece, with every major character getting a bit of the spotlight each issue. One of the neat things about Legion's cast is that most of our core team is either directly related to or is synonymous with a member of the Legion of Superheroes, henceforth referred to as the Future Legion for simplicity's sake. And while it doesn't really have much impact on the series at this point, it's still a neat concept. We'll start off with the group's leader, and our de facto protagonist, Vril Dox. Those of you more familiar with the Future Legion, or DC in general, will probably recognize the connection right away. But for those of you who aren't, you'll likely be more familiar with his father, Vril Dox Sr., better known as the supervillain Brainiac. Dox is a very interesting character, although he grows the least as a person over the series. Dox is a character I would best describe as lawful neutral. He's a cruel, emotionless, manipulative bastard of a man who sees the people around him as nothing more than tools, not caring about what they think or how they feel. But his motives are pure, and his schemes, despite the treachery he relies on to get them to work, are almost always 100% successes, and very rarely does he ever truly put himself over the well-being of everyone else, even if he treats everyone in his immediate vicinity as less than nothing. His childhood with Brainiac is never used as a defense or a crutch, instead used to explain why he is the way he is, with Dox's less than savory dealings nearly always being called out by the other core members. He does certainly lean very heavily authoritarian with his decisions, and at points can be downright fascistic, but Dox himself never shows any indication of having those ideologies. It always comes off as him simply deciding that the actions he makes are the most logical and efficient way to reach his end goal of peace and prosperity, and that his literal lack of a conscience and inability to truly feel emotions or empathy leave him unable to see the problems with his actions without outside interference. It's certainly interesting, especially later on, where someone's general perception of Dox is entirely dependent on how much they know Dox as a person, with the average Joe Schmo idolizing Dox for being a heroic paragon of justice, and the more you go up in the ranks in Legion, the more and more despised Dox is as a person. But on the highest level, the audience understands Dox 100%, and he becomes a much more complex character because of that. Next up, we have the second in command of the crew, Larissa Maller, the ancestor of Tasmia Maller, aka Shadowlass. Larissa serves as the team's conscience and something of a mediator between Dox and the rest of the gang. Being the shadow champion of her homeworld, Talok 8, she herself has a strong drive for justice and peace, which leads to her usually being the first to go along with and agree with Dox's plans, but also usually means she's the first one to call out Dox for his insane bullshit as well. This leads to her having a lot in common with him personality-wise, although definitely sharing more of the positive elements than the negative. She's certainly a bit uptight and tends to handle tense situations poorly, but she certainly handles it better than Dox usually does, and actually has the ability to treat others like they're actual living, breathing people and not weird meat puppets to be used as spare parts. In fact, it's because of that she becomes second in command in the first place, with Dox more or less forcing it on her after she took up leadership during a brief absence of his, which of course annoys her to no end. She's not as complex as Dox. Admittedly, we get some snippets of her backstory near the end of the year, where we find out that her capture by the Alliance and getting roped into Dox's nonsense is keeping her from her people and her daughter, which is her primary motive for not wanting to get into Legion, but it isn't explored much in year 1. Up next we have Strada. Strada doesn't get much development early on compared to the others, largely just serving as the muscle of the crew. She's usually the first one to join on with Dox's schemes, but tends to do so begrudgingly, usually accepting the futility of objecting to it. And the conflict does lead to a lot of great moments with her, but sadly early on she's rather flat as a character. I think her design is neat, but it gets better when she changes from the drab brown-gray rock to the pinkish-white crystal coloring. Speaking of, I think the most interesting element of Strada in the first year is her gender, as she's initially introduced in the book as male up until around issue 8 when she becomes female. This is presented as an in-universe change, a feature of her species where their biological gender doesn't make itself known until they've reached physical maturity, and is presented as a significant shock to Strada, and the way it affects her and how she handles it is a very interesting character arc for her over the course of the series. But since it comes right at the tail end of year 1, it's not explored all that much. Then there's Garen Beck. Beck, a former narcotics officer on widely infamous drug manufacturing world Chiron, the equivalent of trying to repair a battleship with chewing gum, Beck is largely the comedic relief of the team, taking the largest brunt of abuse and humiliation of the crew. He does tend to be rather whiny, typically the first to object to anything proposed by Dox or any order he's given in general, but usually he backs down and gives in right away. This might all sound rather negative of him, but the truth is I actually do quite enjoy Beck. His suffering is rather amusing, and he's not totally one-dimensional. He's given a lot of room to grow in the first year. It helps that the second half focuses on his homeworld and his backstory, how, much like other cops from Chiron, the fight against the drug lords of the world slowly became futile to him, as well as his relationship with his estranged wife, Mary Jane, man, fucking spacer names. Anyways, his patheticness makes him very endearing to me. After that, we have Stealth, a mysterious alien entity who gets roped up in Dox's schemes mostly because she thinks they're fun. I'll be entirely honest, I have the least to say about her, at least at this early point. She's rather bland, and other than being kinda bitchy, there's not much I can say about her during the first year without discussing story spoilers. There's an ongoing subplot about how she's some bizarre, unknown life form that no one can really figure out, but it doesn't start becoming a focal point until later on. She has the power to create fields of total silence around her, which is a really neat power to have, but other than that, she's rather flat during this first year. Last up, we have a nameless Durlin, who the crew only refer to as the Durlin. Effectively serving as Dox's sidekick and confidant, Durlin acts as a surrogate conscience for Dox personally, being someone who Dox springboards ideas off of and being the one to show him the flaws or the ethical hazards of them. Their relationship is rather interesting, as while it's made clear that Derlin only helps out Dox because he owes a debt to him, and Dox treats him more like a toy or a servant rather than an equal, they do show that the two do genuinely like each other, and Derlin wants to help Dox, and Dox likes the Derlin's company and his input as much as he loathes to accept it. He's also cowardly, but not as much as Beck, and is willing to actually stand up for himself against abuse, usually. Sadly, we don't get to learn much about Derlin during this point in time, as he leaves the book rather early on, suddenly disappearing during issue 9 and being replaced by FaZe, a mysterious girl with amnesia who most certainly definitely does not have any similarities in personality, appearance, and power set to a certain member of the Future Legion. No siree, none at all whatsoever. FaZe only gets to be in 2 issues before the year ends, so there's not much more to say about her at this point in time. The core Legion crew are all quite varied, and their relationships with... What? Oh shit, you're right. Actually, you know what? I forgot someone, didn't I? Not sure how that happened, but then again, the character in question is so obscure and they're so irrelevant to the series as a whole that honestly I just kind of glossed over them in my mind. But you know what? I'm underestimating the audience. Maybe someone watching will have heard of this guy. You never know, right? His name is Lobo. Yes, all joking aside, the main man himself rounds out the core Legion team here. Now, while Lobo had been around before this point, he was still relatively unknown prior to this. His most high-profile appearance being his brief appearance in Justice League International, but that only occurred a few months before his appearance in Legion anyways. Design-wise, Lobo is still a bit weird-looking here. While he's ditched his weird spandex bodysuit from Omega Men and has his classic biker gear style, he's far smaller physically and not nearly as roided up as he looks in modern times, with his eyes being really beady and the black markings being drawn in a completely different way. Personality-wise, on the other hand, Lobo has pretty much been nailed down here, with very little difference between his current self and how he is in Legion. Rude, violent, psychotic, kind of an idiot but smarter than he acts, and overall just kind of a horrible person. But his honor-bound nature is also in place, joining Legion because Dox hires him and more or less forces him to follow his orders and act as his agent by abusing contractual shenanigans. Which is not to say he doesn't try to get out of it or bends the rules to his liking, but he's not happy to be here. Anyways, the core Legion crew are all quite varied, and their relationship with each other is one of the major highlights of the book. Giffen has a lot of experience with team books, and he brings that here in full force. The first year of Legion, as opposed to later years which are more serialized, has 2 ongoing story arcs told throughout. The first arc, told across the first 4 issues, features Dox shanghaiing the crew to his homeworld of Kolu to overthrow the computer tyrants. Even though technically it already happened, but the crisis kinda has that effect on things. It's pretty fun, it does a good job of establishing everyone well, and the stakes are suitably high. You really get the feeling that Dox has had this plan cooking in his head for years, and there's not a single scenario he couldn't predict. Dox is more openly manipulative here as opposed to later. Here he's pretty blatant about the fact that he's deliberately steering everyone in the direction he wants them to go in against their will, which certainly does him no favors. The computer tyrants fall fairly easy, with Dox and Co defeating them halfway through, although it's only a temporary defeat since they come back after building a body for themselves. The fight with the tyrant's physical form is a bit bland though, it's mostly just a big dog pile on them until they decide to fly away when Dox blows up their original machine body. I do like how they show the aftermath of the defeat of the tyrants, and they actually stick around to rebuild rather than just take off. You tend not to see that in these revolution plots, and the way that the entire planet starts to literally crash and burn after the tyrants go offline and they're no longer controlling the populace is pretty shocking when it first comes up. There's a bit of a ticking clock element with the Legion crew trying to get the Koluans to be self-sufficient, but it's not really a focal point of the story. The most we get is a single segment where Dox starts planning to brainwash the populace with his own little enhanced charisma program, and while he tries to claim that it's only because it's going to make their job easier, he kind of misses the fact that he's basically doing exactly what the computer tyrants were doing in the first place, and doesn't really decide to change his mind until the Derlin literally beats the shit out of him and tells him to stop. On that similar train of thought, Lobo's introduction feels pretty tacked on here. Larissa and Beck, after wisely deciding to get the fuck out of Dodge, accidentally kill one of Lobo's pet space dolphins, yeah just roll with it, which pisses him off so much he tracks them down to Kolu to try and kill them, only sparing them because Dox makes a deal with him at the last second. It's not a bad introduction, it's certainly in character for Lobo, but it still comes off as a little lazy. Overall, the first major arc is a solid introduction, and if you're not hooked by then, I'm not sure you ever will be, to be entirely honest. The second arc, running from issue 5 to the end of the year, focuses on the actual formation of Legion as an organization. Yeah, rather weirdly, despite being called Legion, the actual group of Legion doesn't formally exist until around issue 10 or 11 or so. Here we find out that Dox's primary motivation for everything up to this point and beyond was to form an intergalactic peacekeeping group, directly citing the then recent dissolution of the Green Lantern Corps as his primary motive. And in case you're wondering how much this dates this series, I'm pretty sure it wasn't the first time that it happened, and it definitely would not be the last time it happened. Anyways, Dox and the gang set off to Cairn, Beck's homeworld, to make it the starting point for Legion. Exactly why Dox wants to start with Cairn isn't entirely clear. He explains his reasoning for why he wants to take down the drug lord running the place, Canis Biz, and how he plans on doing it, but why he decides to make Cairn stop numero uno isn't entirely addressed. My guess is that he came to the conclusion that since Cairn is such an intergalactically notorious shithole that by taking down the drug lords and bringing peace and prosperity to the planet would immediately get other worlds knocking on his door for his services. Not that that ends up being entirely wrong, of course, but that just never gets inferred to the audience. Dox starts to become less directly manipulative and resorting to more subtle and backhanded manipulation by tricking the gang into thinking he sent Lobo to Off-Biz to send them into his stronghold so they can assist from inside, when he and Lobo actually go to storm it after taking control of the local police. We find out that the reason Beck wanted to stay away from Cairn is because he had married Biz's daughter as a part of a way to try and bust him, which failed and made a fool of him, and it was all just really awkward for him, and it's just another entry into the suffering marathon that is Garen Beck. Biz does get taken out way too easily in my opinion though. He's introduced in one issue and then gets taken down in the very next, getting shot unceremoniously between pages. I do like that Dox just does straight up shoot him, and he makes a great point for his reasoning despite the admittedly deserved criticism over his actions. But then the fight with the other drug lords who show up for revenge isn't as interesting, although it does have this great scene of Dox taking advantage of Lobo's power to create clones of himself from parts of his body to make an army of Lobos, and for the first big show off of this power Lobo has, it's pretty well done. The fight is heavily brutal, but the violence isn't too overboard since most of the gorier parts are off screen. But then once all the drug lords are dead and Legion can begin forming for reals, things take a massive curveball when Stealth, for essentially no reason, goes completely insane and rapes and murders Dox, presumably not in that order, for basically no real reason. Now this does get elaborated on further and explored later on, but in the immediate moment it's pretty shocking. We're told that it's some strange biological compulsion that is apparently a common feature for her species, if anyone knew what species Stealth was, and she does at least seem horrified about what she did. Then again, she seems more worried that it was with Dox and not the fact she killed him. Thankfully, of course, this is a comic book, and Dox comes back a-okay a few issues later, just in time to deal with a berserker Lobo who's trying to weasel out of his contract. Unluckily for Lobo, Dox took advantage of his time being revived and gave himself a power boost, leading to him wiping the floor with Lobo in a really entertaining fight scene. And that's pretty much where year 1 of Legion leaves off. Cairn has been slowly but surely freed of its drug problem, Dox finally has his team of intergalactic peacekeepers ready to spread out across the galaxy, Strata goes on a journey of self-discovery, Beck and his wife try to patch up their relationship, and everybody's happy but Lobo. But things aren't all as good as the computer tyrants are still around, having crashed on Larissa's homeworld of Talok 8 and are already plotting their revenge. Legion does an amazing job at setting up what the direction of the series is and what to expect from it. While it does have some jankier elements and there's a bit of a struggle with figuring out what the characters will be, you can tell Grant and Giffen have a clear vision for what they want planned out here, and it's mostly the smaller details they seem to have overlooked. Everyone has a clear motive and distinct personality. No one feels wasted or like they're just there for filler. Up to this point, the villains have been rather lame. The computer tyrants get better when they come back later on, but Biz and the other drug lords were pretty lame. Kitson's art is great. The use of a lot of paler colors leads to a surprisingly diverse color palette without feeling like the pages are washed out. Although I feel like a modern reprinting would likely hurt in trying to replicate it, it would probably make it a little too bright or neon-y in some places. Everyone has a very distinct look, both in appearance and in clothing, especially once they start switching to the Legion uniforms and everyone gets their own personal customization. Legion starts off fairly strong, and it only gets better as it goes on, and I would strongly recommend you read it. It does help having some degree of familiarity with the future Legion. There are several references and callouts to their stories and characters that you'll likely miss if you're not too aware of them, but there's no absolute requirement to read them to understand Legion. But we're not quite done yet, folks, as next up we have Taskmaster's miniseries from 2020. You know, it's a bit hard to believe that I hadn't talked about anything Marvel related before now. I didn't do it intentionally, just nothing worth talking about really came up before now. I will freely admit that I am more of a DC fan these days, so I'm not exactly paying much attention to Marvel, which is not to say that I hate Marvel outright. There are still characters and books I'm following from them. And one of those characters is Taskmaster. I really quite like Taskmaster. I've always liked how he's basically a regular blue-collar guy trying to earn a living, and that living is being a professional bad guy. He's a literal supervillain for hire, and he's absolutely giddy about it 24/7, and that earnestness is what I love about him. So does this new miniseries do him justice? Stick around and you'll find out. Maria Hill has been murdered. The culprit, none other than Taskmaster himself. With her death shocking the super spy community at large, the hunt for Taskmaster begins as a massive target gets drawn on his back. This is a major inconvenience to our skull-faced merc, least of all because he's not the one who killed her. Now forced to team up with Nick Fury, no not that one, Taskmaster goes on a globe-trotting journey to uncover the mysterious project Hill was investigating before her death, and more importantly, save his own ass in the process. Now immediately I have issues with the premise. Like I said, I'm not exactly the most familiar with modern Marvel, but I'm aware enough to know that Maria Hill isn't really the most popular person in the Marvelverse. In fact, I would dare say that it would be rather difficult to find someone who has a lower popularity ranking than Maria Hill, whose name isn't Doctor Doom. So her supposed murder, causing as big an uproar as we're told, is rather hard to believe, and makes it really obvious to the reader that she's not actually dead right from the beginning. And Taskmaster himself even acknowledges this fact, but all of this is glossed over so the plot can happen. The bulk of the story focuses on Taskmaster and Fury trying to solve the mystery of the Rubicon Trigger, a mysterious hammer project that Maria Hill was trying to crack into, sealed within an unnecessarily complicated security system requiring the very specific body movement signatures of 3 different people, a feat that Taskmaster is just so conveniently perfect for. This leads Fury and Taskmaster across the globe to get the signatures from the 3 targets. Phil Coulson, Black Panther's sidekick, I think? I know she works for him, I'm not really sure. And some lady I've never heard of, with each issue focusing on one of the 3. It's not a terrible premise, it's rather basic in all honesty. Again, the biggest problem with the plot is how obvious it's made that Taskmaster is being set up by Hill to do her dirty work for her, and it's not all that exciting. The individual issues are rather fun, each issue following the same basic setup of Taskmaster sneaks into where the target is, gets what he needs, and uses the power of buffoonery to get the hell out. Because of this, the majority of the focus is on Taskmaster himself. Naturally, of course, doing the opposite in his own series would be insane, and this leads to what my favorite thing about this mini was, and that's how Taskmaster is written. Major props are given to Jed MacKay here, as he shows that he really does understand Taskmaster well. He's goofy, greedy, egotistical, he's got a mouth faster than he thinks, and above all, he really loves being a supervillain. But at the end of it all, he's never treated as a joke. Sure, silly things happen to Taskmaster, and he definitely says and does a lot of really funny things, but Taskmaster is never treated as the punchline to any of it. The book always takes the high road and refrains from belittling or mocking Taskmaster directly, instead allowing the humor to come from how Taskmaster reacts to the situation he's in and what he has to deal with. As well, it allows him to be serious too, emphasizing the professional in professional bad guy by having him detail his plans down to the smallest element, showing how he's aware enough of the reality he's in to be able to predict exactly how the good guys will act and to plan around it. This genre savviness also leads to jokes about Taskmaster's business as well, and cracks about superhero comics in general, primarily making jokes about the disposable loved ones cliche, which ends up being significantly plot important, as well as making jokes about the predictability of Nazi supervillains to backstab other villains for no good reason at all. This specific joke I remember people got upset about when the book first came out, because they felt like it came off as yet another example of, oh haha, this unrepentant villain hates Nazis, by which I mean things I, the writer, don't personally agree with, despite them being just as bad if not worse in comparison. Take that, nerds! And in other circumstances, I'd probably agree, except even taking it out of context, it's entirely clear that's not what it's meant to be. Taskmaster makes it entirely clear that he's strictly business related, because anytime a villain freelances for Hydra, or any other Nazi-adjacent baddie, they tend to either get killed off as cannon fodder, or it leads to them having to deal with all sorts of bullshit that isn't worth the pay. Anyways, Tasky is a real treat in this book, and I'm glad the majority of the focus is on him, because the other two major characters are fairly dull. Fury is fine, but he's not all that interesting. He does have a lot of really great back and forth with Taskmaster, and those are the highlights of his scenes, but he's mostly just there as the mission control. Which is fine, he doesn't really need to be anything more than that, and it does make you dislike him or wish he wasn't in the book, but otherwise he's just there. The other major character of the book is Black Widow, who serves as a secondary motivator for Taskmaster, as she's actively hunting him down from minute one to take him out in revenge for Hill. And this is another thing I had major problems with for the premise. When Taskmaster finds out Widow's after him, he reacts with immeasurable shock. But the problem is that this really doesn't make sense for him in any way to react this shocked about it when you take into account most of his history. Taskmaster, a guy who routinely solos the biggest and baddest dudes in the Marvel Universe, a man who debuted soloing the entire Avengers, arguably one of the strongest normal humans, in comparison at the very least, around, being afraid of Black Widow by herself is hardly believable, and to be perfectly honest, it makes a whole lot of characters, Taskmaster especially, seem way less impressive if Black Widow is the one he's the most afraid of. And I understand why they did Black Widow. I get why she's here. It's shilling for the Black Widow movie because Taskmaster is allegedly in it. No, that is not fucking Taskmaster. I refuse to acknowledge him as Taskmaster. I don't fucking know what they were thinking with that costume. God damn it, this fucking G.I. Joe wannabe bitch pisses me off so much it's insane. I wish this MCU shit would die already. Anyways, the problem with it is not so much that Taskmaster's reaction to her is unbelievable, although it definitely is. It's more that the plot only works if Taskmaster acts this way. The only real reason he bothers to work with Fury to solve the mystery is because he's afraid of Widow cutting his nuts off, but to do this he needs to be taken out of character in order to be afraid of Widow. If you have him react as he should to her hunting him with at most annoyance and at best ambivalence, then now you don't really have any plot because he has no reason to hide with Fury to clear his name because there isn't any major threat to him. The obvious fix would be to either A, have Widow be backed up by a massive team, or B, have it be a revolving door of different super spies / assassins who are hunting down Taskmaster. But as it is, Black Widow. Widow is kind of a non-entity. She has one fight with him in issue 3 that gets sidetracked by White Fox, and their only real fight in the last issue isn't particularly interesting. Taskmaster's other fights in the mini are okay as well. I like how Taskmaster holds his own and gets over in most of the fights. The exception is his fight with Hyperion, for obvious reasons, but the fights are mostly filler in the story, not that that's anything unique to this series in general, of course. And I really enjoyed the ending. Without giving it away, I like that it leaves things off on a high note, and Taskmaster walks away on top. Overall, the miniseries had a flawed premise, but executed it fairly well. The writer really understands Taskmaster well and provides plenty of material for him to shine in, but the overarching plot hamstrings the story and more variety could have been presented. The mystery of the Rubicon trigger isn't all that interesting, and the true nature of it doesn't come off very surprising considering that the guy who designed it was Norman fucking Osborn. I wish there was more variety to the supporting cast as well, but none of them hog the spotlight or bring down the overall quality of the book. I do think 5 issues was perfect for it, however. With the story we're given, stretching it out would have not worked as well, and as is, they managed to get everything they wanted to tell done without it dragging on or feeling like it's outstayed its welcome. The art is wonderful here. The artist, Alessandro Vitti, does a great job at bringing a near photorealistic style to the art, and it's pulled off well. The coloring and shading definitely enhance the effect. Usually that's the biggest killer to the photorealistic style that makes it seem uncanny, and that's thankfully avoided. It also helps that it doesn't try to go too heavily realistic and stays somewhat cartoony. This certainly aids Taskmaster as well, since he's very expressive here. I'm glad that they remembered how that his mask can move and emote like a real face, and it really helps sell the more comedic moments. I would say check it out if you like Taskmaster. It's a very solid outing for him, and there's a lot of great moments of him to enjoy here. It's not an awful read otherwise, but there isn't much reason to check it out unless you're a fan of the character. I would say start elsewhere if you want to learn more about Taskmaster, but it's not necessarily a bad introduction to him. And on that note, I believe that's all for this time. This has been Jay, and as I return to the void between pages, I look forward to when next we may meet, and I can share what else I've been reading.